You are awake. Someone is kneeling over you, holding your head steady, and they are cutting a slow circle into your skull with a sharpened piece of stone. You can feel the scrape of it, round and round, patient, unhurried, working through the bone, one thin layer at a time. This is not a nightmare, and it is not a scene from a film. It happened to real people in real places, thousands of years before anyone wrote the word surgeon. And here is the part almost nobody expects. Most of them lived. That one word is the reason this video exists. Not they tried, not they died horribly. They lived. They walked around afterward, ate, worked, grew old, and carried the healed evidence in their heads for the rest of their lives. Brain surgery is the thing we point to when we want to describe the absolute ceiling of human skill. It is the phrase we use as a joke about difficulty. It's not brain surgery, we say, meaning this is the easy stuff, the hard stuff is over there at the very edge of what people can do. So what does it mean that the edge of what people can do was already being crossed in the Stone Age with tools made of flint and obsidian, and that the patients on that table survived at rates that would embarrass hospitals much closer to our own time than to theirs? For most of the last few centuries, the standard assumption about ancient people ran in one direction. They were us, but worse. Weaker medicine, shorter lives, less knowledge, more superstition. Anything that looked advanced had to be an accident or a fluke or a misreading of the evidence. When the first prehistoric skulls with neat holes in them started turning up in the 1800s, the reflex was exactly that. Surely the holes were made after death? Surely they were wounds, or the work of animals, or ritual damage done to a corpse. Surely no one in the deep past was opening a living human head on purpose and expecting the person to get up again. The idea was too absurd to take seriously. And then someone looked closely at the bone, and the absurd idea turned out to be the correct one. The someone was a French physician and anthropologist named Paul Broca, working in the 1860s and 70s. Broca is remembered today mostly for his work on the brain and language, but he spent years puzzling over a growing collection of prehistoric skulls with openings cut into them, many of them dug from Neolithic sites in France. What stopped him cold was not the holes themselves. It was the edges of the holes. Bone is alive. When you break it or cut it, if the person survives, the body responds. The sharp, raw edge of fresh bone slowly smooths, rounds, and thickens as new bone grows back in. It is unmistakable under the eye of anyone who knows what to look for. And Broca saw it again and again on these ancient skulls. Rounded rims, remodeled bone, openings that had begun to close. These were not injuries from the moment of death. These were operations, and they were operations the patient had lived through, sometimes by years, because dead bone does not heal. Think about what that requires you to believe. It requires you to believe that a community with no metal, no anesthetic as we know it, no germ theory, no written medicine, decided to cut through a living person's skull and did it carefully enough and cleanly enough and with enough understanding of what they were doing that the person walked away. Once you accept the healed edge as proof, you cannot unsee it. The deep past stops being a place of helpless suffering and becomes something much stranger. A place where somebody had figured out a procedure we still consider terrifying and figured out how to make people survive it. The name we give the procedure is trepanation. It simply means making an opening in the skull. And the reason it matters is not that it was rare and shocking, it's that it wasn't rare at all. Consider a single skull from Ensisheim in the Alsace region of France, roughly 7,000 years old. This person did not have one opening in their head, they had two, and both of them show healing. Two separate operations on the same skull, and the man survived both, living on afterward with the bone slowly knitting around each opening. That is not a desperate one-time gamble, that is a repeat procedure performed on someone whom the community clearly expected to keep alive twice. Across Neolithic Europe, hundreds of trepanned skulls have now been recorded. In some cemeteries, the trepanned aren't even unusual. They lie among the ordinary dead, people who lived and were buried like everyone else, carrying a hole in the head that had long since begun to close. So the first thing the evidence destroys is the idea that this was ritual mutilation of the dead. You do not perform delicate healing surgery on a corpse, and a corpse does not grow new bone. The second thing it destroys is the idea that it was random. The openings cluster in particular regions of the skull, made with recognizable techniques in ways that repeat across time and distance. Somebody was teaching this. Somebody was learning it. It was a skill held and passed down, like flint knapping or tanning or weaving. And that raises the only question that actually matters. The question this whole video is built to answer. Not, did they do it? They did. The question is why it worked. Before we cross an ocean to answer that, stay in Neolithic Europe a little longer and let yourself stand inside one of these moments. A person lies still on a hide in the open air or the mouth of a shelter, held gently by people who know them. A man kneels over them with a flint tool, its edge napped down to something fine and hard. He does not hurry. He works one small patch of the scalp and the bone beneath it, scraping in slow strokes, pausing, checking, scraping again, while the others keep the patient calm and the head still. Around them is everything the modern operating room strips away, and none of the things it adds. No steel, no anesthetic mask, no monitors. And yet the essential act is the same patient removal of bone a surgeon performs today. This is where the tool itself matters, because we assume the crudeness of stone doomed the patient. A well-made flint or obsidian edge is not a crude thing. Napped correctly, it can be honed finer than a modern steel blade, sharp enough that surgeons in our own time have experimented with obsidian scalpels for exactly that reason. The tools of the deep past were simpler than ours. They were not blunter. And there is a detail from these European sites stranger than almost any other, one that shows how deeply the practice ran through the culture. Barthélemy Prunier, the French doctor who first gathered many of the Trepanation skulls from the caves of southern France and brought them to wider attention, found something lying alongside the openings. Small, smooth, polished discs of human skull bone. Rondelles, they came to be called. Some had been cut from trepanations themselves, and some had been pierced and carried, it seems, as amulets, fragments of a person's skull kept and worn. Whatever exactly they meant, they tell you the operation was not a shameful last resort hidden from view. It sat close to the center of how these people understood the head, the self, and survival. The bone that was cut away did not become waste. It became something worth keeping. But the Neolithic skulls of Europe are not even the place where this story gets truly strange. For that, you have to cross the ocean and travel to the coast and highlands of ancient Peru. Because the single richest record of skull surgery anywhere on Earth is not in the caves of France. It is in the Andes. The story of how the world learned? This begins in 1865 with an American named Ephraim George Squier. Squier was a diplomat and archaeologist traveling in Peru, and he came into possession of a pre-Columbian skull with a clean, squared opening cut into the front of it. He brought it back and showed it to the medical establishment, and eventually it reached Broca himself. And once again, the crucial detail was the bone. The edges of that squared window showed healing. Whoever had lived inside that skull had survived the operation in a part of the world that had never heard of European medicine, using entirely their own knowledge. That single Peruvian skull did something important. It proved that skull surgery was not a one-off European accident. It had been invented more than once, independently, by people with no contact between them. Two different halves of the world separately arrived at the same audacious idea, that you can open a living human head and the person can survive. And in the Andes, they did not stop at one skull or 100. They did it thousands of times. The Paracas culture on the Peruvian coast, more than 2,000 years ago, has left behind a startling number of trepan skulls, some of them belonging to people whose heads had also been deliberately shaped in infancy, bound to grow long and tall. Later, Andean cultures kept the practice alive, refining it, until by the time of the Inca, it had become something close to a genuine surgical tradition. The person who has spent more time with these skulls than almost anyone alive is John Verano, an anthropologist at Tulane University who has studied Peruvian trepanation for decades. What Verano and his colleagues found working through hundreds of these skulls is not a picture of butchery. It is a picture of steady, measurable improvement. The kind of improvement you only see when a skill is being practiced and backward studied and handed down, generation after generation, with real feedback about what keeps people alive. Here is how you read survival off a skull, because it is worth understanding exactly. A hole with sharp, raw, unhealed edges means the person died on the table or very soon after. There was no time for the bone to respond. A hole with smooth, rounded, remodeled edges means the person lived long enough for healing to begin, often much longer. And a hole somewhere in between tells you the person survived a while but not forever. By counting these categories across many skulls, you can actually calculate a survival rate for the surgery. Not a guess, a number drawn from the bone itself. And the number that comes next is the one that should genuinely unsettle you. In the earliest Andean samples, survival was modest. Many patients died, but over centuries, the picture shifts, hard in one direction. By the later periods, the majority of patients whose skulls we can examine show clear healing. In the best studied later groups, survival estimates climb into the range of roughly 3 out of 4, and in some samples, higher still. 3 out of 4 people surviving skull surgery, performed with tools of bronze, stone, and obsidian by people who left no textbooks. That alone would be remarkable. But the number only becomes truly astonishing when you set it next to the thing we are about to compare it to. Because the natural assumption is that surgery got safer as we got closer to the present, that the ancient world was dangerous and modernity made it safe in a smooth line from then to now. That assumption is where the whole story turns over. First, though, we have to reconstruct what actually happened on that table, because the how is inseparable from the why it worked. Picture the patient. In a great many cases, this is not a healthy person being operated on for mysterious reasons. This is someone with a serious head injury. In the Andes especially, the pattern is striking. The trepanations cluster on the parts of the skull most likely to be struck in combat on the left in front, exactly where a right-handed attacker's blow lands. Many of these patients were men, and many of their skulls show signs of the very fractures the surgery was meant to treat. When a heavy blow caves in a section of skull, it presses fragments of bone inward, and blood can pool between the skull and the brain. The pressure builds. Left alone, that pressure kills. But if you can open the skull, lift away the shattered pieces, and let the trapped blood drain and the pressure release, you can save a life that would otherwise be lost. This is not magic, this is mechanics. And crucially, it is the same reason a neurosurgeon opens a skull today. So the ancient surgeon was often not gambling on a healthy head. They were treating a specific, visible, understood problem on a patient who would otherwise die, which changes everything about the odds. They were choosing cases they could actually help. Let yourself stand in that scene too, because it is a different world from the quiet Neolithic shelter. A man is carried in from a fight. The side of his head caved where a stone club or a slung stone struck him. He drifts in and out. The people around him can read the problem on sight because they have seen it before. The bone pushed inward, the pressure building underneath toward the point of no return. The surgeon has done this many times, on many heads exactly like this one. He settles the patient, works him into a state where the pain can be borne, with coca and drink and the steadying hands of others. Then he begins, not by driving a tool through the skull, but by scraping, easing away the broken bone a fraction at a time, lifting the crushed fragments clear, opening a path for the trapped blood to escape and the swelling to breathe. When it is finished, the wound is dressed and bound, and then comes the part no record describes, but every healed skull confirms. days, then weeks of the patient simply living, the bone beginning its slow work of closing, the surgeon's judgment proven right one more time. Now, watch the technique itself more closely, because the technique is the second half of the answer. There was more than one method, and the choice of method mattered enormously for survival. The most dangerous approach was to bore or cut straight down in a ring and pop out a full disc of bone, which risked plunging through into the membrane and the brain beneath in a single wrong moment. Far safer was scraping. The surgeon would take a sharpened stone or metal edge and slowly abrade the bone away, layer by thin layer across a small patch, watching constantly. The great advantage of scraping is control. You can feel the bone thinning under your hand. You can stop the instant you break through, before you damage what lies beneath. The tough membrane covering the brain and the brain itself could be left untouched. Many of the highest survival skulls show exactly this careful, graded, gentle approach, the opening beveled like a shallow bowl rather than punched straight through. The surgeons had learned across generations which method killed and which method saved, and they had shifted toward the one that saved. There's a second kind of knowledge hidden in these skulls, and it is the knowledge of where not to cut. Run your fingers over your own head, along the midline from your forehead, back over the crown. Directly beneath that line, inside the skull, runs a large channel of blood, and to open the bone, there is to invite a bleed you cannot stop. Across cultures and across thousands of years, the ancient surgeons tended to avoid exactly those danger zones, placing their openings off to the side, over the safer expanses of bone, away from the deadly middle. That is not luck. Luck does not repeat itself across thousands of skulls on two separate continents. It is anatomical understanding, learned the hardest way imaginable and then preserved as rule. This spot is survivable. That spot is death. Stay away from the line. They could not have drawn you a diagram of the vessels beneath the bone, but their hands knew where those vessels were. And the pain. We assume the pain alone would have made this impossible, but the ancient Andes had answers there too. Coca leaf, chewed and applied, has genuine numbing properties. Fermented drink could dull awareness. Various plants across the ancient world had sedative and pain-reducing effects that people knew and used. It would not have been painless as we understand painlessness, but it would not have been the pure, screaming agony we instinctively imagine either. These were not people fumbling in the dark. They were people working with the tools their world offered, and their world offered more than we credit it for. Which brings us to the comparison this entire video has been walking toward. Because there is one comparison left, and it is the one that turns the whole story on its head. Set the ancient Andean surgeon beside a surgeon from the American Civil War in the 1860s, 2,500 years apart, roughly. On paper, it is not a contest. The Civil War surgeon has steel instruments, formal medical training, an emerging science of anatomy, printed textbooks, and the entire momentum of the modern age behind him. The Andean surgeon has bronze, stone, obsidian, and knowledge passed by hand and memory. If survival tracked technology in a straight line, the Civil War operating table should be dramatically safer. It was not. When patients in the Civil War underwent operations that opened the skull, a large share of them died, often around half or more. The ancient Andean patients in the best studied later groups survived at markedly higher rates. People operated on with stone thousands of years earlier walked away from skull surgery more often than soldiers operated on with steel in the age of railroads and telegraphs. Read that again slowly until it stops sounding like a mistake, because it is not a mistake. It is one of the most reliably documented reversals in the history of medicine. Now, the only honest question, why? How does that gap even exist? The answer is not that ancient people were secretly more advanced in some general magical way. The answer is far more specific and far more interesting, and it lands on one single thing: infection. For most of human history, the thing that killed surgical patients was not the cut. It was what happened to the cut afterward. It was infection, invisible, creeping in from dirty hands, dirty tools, dirty conditions, dirty wounds. And the tragedy of 19th century Western surgery is that it had just enough technology to open bodies confidently, and not yet the one idea that would have made doing so safe. Surgeons in that era did not understand germs. They operated in blood-stiffened coats they were proud of. They passed the same unwashed hands and the same uncleaned instruments from one patient to the next. They probed deep wounds with bare fingers to feel for damage, dragging contamination directly into the body. Hospitals were crowded, and infections spread through them like weather. It was, in a bitter sense, the perfect machine for killing people you had just successfully operated on. The surgery worked. The aftermath killed them. The ancient Andean surgeon avoided almost all of that. And here is the quietly stunning part. They avoided it whether or not they could have explained why. Their operations were often performed in drier, less crowded conditions than a war hospital. They were not moving between dozens of infected patients in a single ward. Some of the plant substances they used had genuine antiseptic properties. Their techniques minimized the size and depth of the wound and left the protective membranes intact. And critically, they were not dragging the accumulated filth of a busy surgical practice from one open skull to the next. Whether by hard-won tradition, by careful observation of what led to death, or simply by the nature of how and where they worked, they sidestepped the single deadliest force in surgery. The 19th century surgeon, with all his steel and all his confidence, walked straight into it. That is the resolution of the paradox, and it is worth stating plainly, because it is the whole point. Primitive did not mean stupid. It never did. The ancient surgeons were not our inferiors who got lucky. They were skilled practitioners of a difficult craft who, on the specific and decisive matter of not killing the patient afterward, happened to be doing things right at a time when much advanced medicine was doing them catastrophically wrong. Progress, it turns out, is not a straight line, where every century beats the one before it. Sometimes a piece of knowledge is found, then lost, then found again. Sometimes the fancy new tools arrive, long before the humble idea that makes them safe. And sometimes a person with a sharpened stone genuinely did know something that a person with a steel scalpel did not. You might still be reaching for one last escape from this. Maybe they only did it a few times. Maybe the survivors are the ones we happen to find. But the record won't let you off. There are thousands of these skulls. There are individuals who were opened twice, 3 times, and in the most extraordinary Andean cases, as many as 7 separate times, the openings healed, meaning the same person came back to the same kind of surgeon and lived again and again and again. There are whole regional traditions of the practice, with recognizable local styles spanning centuries. This was not a fluke that happened to leave a lucky bone behind. This was medicine, real, developed, taught, improving medicine in a world we had written off as helpless. And the practice was not confined to prehistory or to Peru. In ancient Greece, around the 2,500 years ago, the physicians of the Hippocratic tradition wrote down when and how to open the skull after certain head injuries, with careful instructions about which fractures called for it and how to proceed. What is most striking about those instructions is not the cutting, it is the restraint. They did not say, open every injured head. They set out which kinds of fractures called for the operation and which did not, when to wait and when to act, and how to avoid doing more harm than the injury itself. That is diagnosis. That is judgment about when surgery helps and when it only endangers. The exact quality we still prize most in a good doctor. It was in the medical literature at the very foundation of Western medicine. The idea that you sometimes must open the skull to save the brain beneath is not a modern breakthrough. It is one of the oldest surgical ideas humans have. So old that it appears independently across the Neolithic, across the ancient Mediterranean, and across the pre-Columbian Americas, in cultures that could not possibly have taught it to one another, which tells you something almost eerie. Faced with the same problem, the pressure of a damaged brain against an unyielding skull, people everywhere reached, again and again, for the same solution. So, What does any of this have to do with you tonight in a world of clean hospitals and machines that see inside the body? More than you would think, because the operation on that Stone Age table has not disappeared. It has descended, unbroken in principle, all the way to the present. Walk into any major hospital today, and the single most direct descendant of trepanation is one of the most important emergency procedures in modern medicine. When a person suffers a severe brain injury and the tissue begins to swell, the swelling has nowhere to go, trapped inside the rigid box of the skull, and the rising pressure crushes the brain against bone until it dies. The modern response is to open the skull, remove a section of bone, and give the swelling room, releasing the pressure that would otherwise need kill. It is called a craniectomy or a craniotomy, and it saves lives every single day. Strip away the sterile drapes and the power tools and the anesthesia, and the core idea is exactly precisely the one on that ancient table. The skull is a hard box. Pressure inside it kills. So you open the box. The tools changed almost beyond recognition. The idea did not change at all. And there is a small, almost haunting echo in how it is still done. When a section of skull is removed to relieve that pressure, so surgeons often do not throw it away. They preserve the piece of bone, sometimes tucked inside the patient's own body to keep it viable, and later, once the danger has passed, they fit it back into the head where it belongs. A fragment of skull cut away, kept safe and treasured until it is needed again. 7,000 years after those polished discs of bone were carried out of the caves of France, we are still, in our own way, keeping the piece we remove. There is a strange kind of respect owed here, and it is worth feeling it fully before you close this. The next time you hear someone say a thing is not brain surgery, meaning it is trivial, remember that brain surgery was already being performed and survived before the pyramids, before writing, before the wheel had spread across much of the world. Remember that a person kneeling in the Neolithic or on an Andean hillside with a chip of stone in their hand understood something real about the human body, and understood it well enough to save the person in front of them, more reliably than surgeons who came thousands of years later with far better toys and one fatal blind spot. Our ancestors were not waiting in the dark for us to arrive and switch on the light. They were working and thinking and getting better at it the whole time. You are awake. Someone is standing over you under a bright light in a clean, quiet room, and they are opening your skull to save your life. The stone became steel. The kneeling figure became a team in gowns. The 7,000 years in between filled with everything we ever learned and everything we ever forgot and had to learn again. But the idea in that room, the simple, ancient, life-saving idea, is the same one held in a Stone Age hand. Open the box. Ease the pressure. Let the person live. They knew it then. We know it now. And the only thing that truly separates the two of you is time.